The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as the judge prepared to make his final ruling. The defendant sat rigid, his lawyer whispering last-minute arguments. Across the room, a young girl sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, but beside her, a large, alert dog sat at attention. The crowd murmured, eager to see justice unfold. Then, something strange happened. The girl, who had barely moved throughout the entire trial, twitched her fingers ever so slightly. A barely noticeable flick of her wrist. The dog's ears perked up instantly. His posture changed. His eyes locked onto her, intense and unwavering. First, no one noticed. The lawyers continued speaking. The judge remained focused on the case, and the audience leaned in, waiting for the next argument. But then, she did it again. This time, the dog responded more visibly. His tail stiffened, his head lowered slightly, and a low, almost imperceptible whine escaped him. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Stop," he said, his voice cutting through the courtroom. Everyone froze. The defense attorney stopped mid-sentence. The prosecutor looked up, confused. The girl remained silent, her fingers trembling slightly. The dog, however, had already understood something no one else had. "What did you just do?" the judge asked, his tone sharp but curious. The girl didn't speak, but she repeated the motion. The dog reacted instantly. His body stiffened, his gaze locked onto the man sitting at the defendant's table. The tension in the room became unbearable. The judge's expression darkened. He turned to the defense. "Explain this." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Everyone watched as the young girl, who had been silent throughout the entire trial, had just changed everything. Not with words, but with a hidden signal only her dog could understand. And in that moment, the case took a turn no one saw coming. The courtroom, though grand and imposing, felt eerily cold. The heavy wooden benches, polished to a shine, seemed unwelcoming, their surfaces reflecting the dim, flickering light from the old chandeliers above. The air was thick, not just with the scent of aged paper and leather-bound legal books, but with something else, something unseen, a weight that pressed down on the room like an invisible force, making even the most seasoned legal professionals shift uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's gavel rested heavily on its block, untouched yet commanding an unspoken authority over everyone present. The walls, lined with towering shelves filled with legal volumes, seemed to close in as the tension mounted. The whispers in the room had died down after the judge's abrupt interruption, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was the kind that stretched, that made people hold their breath without realizing it. At the center of it all, the young girl sat motionless, her small frame dwarfed by the courtroom's grand design. Her skin, pale under the harsh overhead lights, seemed to glow faintly against the darkness of her surroundings. Her hands trembled slightly, her fingers flexing with the smallest of movements. Beside her, the dog remained rigid, eyes sharp and alert. A single flick of her fingers had sent him into a quiet, watchful stance, his body language betraying an unease that even the most skeptical observer couldn't ignore. A draft slipped through the cracks in the heavy oak doors, sending a shiver through those seated near the back. The prosecutor cleared his throat, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming tension that now gripped the room. Even the defendant, who had once sat with an air of arrogance, seemed to stiffen in his seat, his fingers curling into the fabric of his suit. Something wasn't right. Everyone could feel it. They just didn't know what it was yet. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary trial. And whatever truth lay hidden within these walls was about to be exposed in a way no one could have imagined. The young girl, Emily Carter, sat stiffly in the witness chair, her small hands clasped together on her lap. She was only 12, but the weight on her shoulders made her seem much older. Her deep brown eyes darted across the room, taking in every face, every movement. She knew she had to be careful. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and everything could fall apart. Emily had always been quiet, the kind of girl who preferred the company of books over people. But her silence had never been out of shyness. it had been out of necessity. She had learned early on that words could be dangerous, that speaking up could bring consequences. She had spent years trapped in a world where fear ruled her life, where every sound, every glance, carried a hidden threat. Now, she was here, in this courtroom, surrounded by strangers who wanted her to speak. But could she? Would they even believe her? Beside her, Duke, her loyal golden retriever, sat with unwavering focus. He was more than just a pet. He was her protector, her only source of safety in a world that had been anything but kind. Duke had been trained as a service dog, his sharp instincts always attuned to Emily's emotions. He could sense the tremor in her hands, the slight hitch in her breath. He knew she was scared, and his presence was the only thing keeping her grounded. Across the room sat the man she feared most, Daniel Mercer. His slicked-back hair, his expensive suit, the smug expression that barely faltered despite the unfolding events. It was all too familiar. Emily's stomach churned as her eyes locked onto him. He had fooled so many people. The police, the neighbors, even some of her own relatives. They all believed his carefully crafted lies. But Emily knew the truth. She had lived it. Her mother's absence in the courtroom spoke volumes. If she had been here, she would have told Emily to stay quiet, to pretend like nothing had happened. But for the first time in her life, Emily wasn't listening. She was tired of the lies, the fear, the way Mercer had stolen everything from her. The judge's voice broke through the thick silence. "Emily, are you ready to begin?" She hesitated. Then, under the table, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible signal to Duke. His ears perked, his body tensed. Something was about to happen. Something no one in this courtroom was prepared for. Emily swallowed hard, her small fingers gripping the armrests of the chair. The judge waited patiently, watching her closely, while the courtroom remained unnervingly silent. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze pressing against her, but none were as suffocating as Daniel Mercer's. He sat across from her, legs crossed, hands folded neatly, as if he had nothing to fear. His expression was calm, almost amused. He didn't think she could do it. He didn't think anyone would believe her. But Emily had Duke. With a barely noticeable flick of her fingers, she gave Duke another signal under the table. The golden retriever, always attuned to her every move, let out a soft but deliberate whine. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is something wrong with your service dog, Emily?" she asked gently. Emily hesitated. The room was waiting for her answer. She knew she couldn't just blurt out the truth. Not yet. If she spoke too soon, if she accused Mercer outright, she risked him manipulating the situation like he always had. She needed proof. She needed them to see what she already knew. I think Duke is trying to tell me something," she murmured, her voice just loud enough for the microphone to catch. There was a murmur through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Tell us what that means, Emily." Emily took a shaky breath and lifted her chin. "He's trained to alert me when I'm in danger." The judge's expression darkened. She turned to Mercer's lawyer, a stiff-looking man who had barely moved since the trial began. "Is there any reason this child should feel unsafe in this courtroom?" The lawyer barely hesitated. "Objection, Your Honor. The child's claim is vague and lacks evidence. Her dog's behavior is hardly." Duke let out a sudden, sharp bark. The sound cut through the air like a gunshot. People flinched. Even the judge looked momentarily startled. But Emily didn't flinch. She knew what Duke was doing. She had seen him react this way before, every time Mercer came too close. Emily turned her gaze back to Mercer. For the first time since the trial began, his smug expression faltered. It was brief, but she caught it. "Emily," the judge said carefully, "can you tell us why Duke is reacting this way?" Emily glanced at the bailiff, who stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. She took another breath. This was her moment. "He can smell it," she said. "He knows what's on him." A collective silence fell over the room. The judge frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily pointed directly at Mercer. "Duke is trained to detect traces of chemicals, substances that shouldn't be there. And I know what Duke is reacting to right now. She clenched her fists. It's chloroform. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, confusion. The judge slammed her gavel, calling for order. But Emily wasn't done. She stood from her chair, placing a steadying hand on Duke's head. I know because I smelled it before. The night he took my mom. The shockwave that passed through the courtroom was undeniable. Mercer's lawyer shot to his feet, ready to protest. But before he could say a word, the judge held up a hand. Silence. Her voice was sharp. She turned to the bailiff. Get someone to examine the defendant immediately. Mercer finally reacted, shifting in his seat. This is ridiculous, he scoffed. She's just a child. You say that a lot. Emily cut in, her voice suddenly steadier than it had been all day. That I'm just a child. But you never expected me to fight back. The bailiff moved swiftly, and in moments Mercer was being patted down. A tense few seconds passed, and then, there's something in his pocket, the officer murmured. He pulled out a small cloth, folded neatly. When he lifted it to his nose, he grimaced. Chemical scent. Strong. Another round of gasps. The tension in the room was unbearable. Mercer's calm demeanor cracked, his face contorting in barely contained anger. This proves nothing, he spat. It's circumstantial. Take him into custody, the judge ordered. Mercer shot up from his seat. You can't do this. Duke lunged forward, barking viciously. Mercer froze, his face pale, his confidence shattered. The officers wasted no time grabbing him, pulling his arms behind his back as he shouted protests. Emily didn't move. She just watched as the man who had tormented her, who had stolen her mother, was finally dragged away. The judge exhaled, rubbing her temples before looking at Emily with something that almost resembled admiration. Emily, she said, her voice softer now, do you know where your mother is? Emily's throat tightened. No, but I know he does. She turned to where Mercer was being restrained. And now he doesn't have anywhere to hide. The judge nodded. Then we'll make sure he has no choice but to talk. For the first time in years, Emily felt something she thought she had forgotten, hope. The courtroom had returned to its rigid formality. But Emily could feel the shift in the air. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the tension of the trial, nor the weight of her father's fate hanging in the balance. It was something else. A presence, an unease, like an unseen force pressing against her skin. The fluorescent lights above flickered briefly before stabilizing, casting a sickly glow over the polished wooden surfaces. The hum of whispered conversations and rustling papers filled the room. But underneath it all, there was silence. A silence that felt unnatural, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Max, her golden retriever, had been still for the past few minutes. Too still. He had been trained to remain calm in stressful environments, but this was different. His ears were raised, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on something. Someone. Emily followed his stare, her breath hitching when she realized what had caught his attention. The juror, the man sitting in the third row, fourth seat from the left. He wasn't looking at the evidence, wasn't paying attention to the lawyers debating her father's innocence. He was watching her. Not just a glance, not just the passing curiosity of a stranger in the room. He was studying her. Emily swallowed, forcing herself to focus on the trial. The prosecutor was hammering away at another piece of so-called evidence, presenting a manipulated confession that her father had allegedly given. She knew it was forced. She knew her father wouldn't have said those things unless someone had made him. But no one else seemed to care. No one else seemed to question why a man with no criminal record, no history of violence, would suddenly confess to something so horrible. A chill ran down her spine. The juror hadn't looked away. Was she imagining it? Was the stress of the trial getting to her? She tore her gaze away, pretending to be engrossed in the legal proceedings, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She could feel his stare like a weight pressing down on her. It was suffocating. Max let out a low whimper. It was almost inaudible, but to Emily, it was as loud as a scream. She barely moved her lips as she whispered to him, "What is it, Boy, Max didn't react to her voice. His focus was locked. His posture had changed from tense to outright defensive. His muscles coiled as if ready to spring. Emily's stomach churned with unease. And then the man moved. Not much, just a slight tilt of his head. But it was enough. Emily's blood turned to ice. She knew that look. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't a passing interest in the girl with the dog. It was recognition. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Had she seen him before? Had her father? Was he connected to this case in some way? Then another thought crept into her mind. One she wished she could dismiss. Had he seen her signal Max earlier? Her stomach clenched. No, it had been subtle. Just a small movement. A hidden cue between her and her dog. No one should have noticed, unless they knew exactly what to look for. A cold breeze slipped through the room. It didn't make sense. There were no open windows, no vents strong enough to cause such a thing. But she felt it, and so did Max. Then bang! The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. Gasps erupted. Someone cursed under their breath. The sound of shuffling feet, papers rustling, the judge's gavel striking wood in an attempt to restore order. Emily's heart nearly jumped out of her chest. It lasted only a second before the emergency lighting flickered on, casting the room in an eerie, dim glow. But something had changed. Emily knew it before she even turned her head. Max's posture had stiffened even more. He was no longer just tense, he was growling. Low, deep, a warning. Emily followed his gaze, her pulse hammering. The juror's seat was empty. Her breath caught in her throat. Where had he gone? How had he moved so quickly? Her eyes darted around the room. The judge was rubbing his temples in frustration, the lawyers whispering among themselves. No one else seemed to notice. No one else seemed to care. Then she spotted him. He was standing near the back of the courtroom now, half hidden in the shadows. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was watching Max. The golden retriever bared his teeth slightly, his body positioned protectively in front of Emily. Then, in the dead silence, the man raised his hand, just slightly, and curled his fingers. A signal. Max reacted instantly. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. But his stance shifted. He lowered his head, his tail stiff, his entire body locked in place. Emily had only seen him do that once before, during training. It was his stance when he recognized a threat. Emily's throat went dry. Who was this man? The judge sighed, shaking his head. Let's get back on track. The power outage was a fluke, nothing more. Proceed. The courtroom gradually settled. Papers were gathered. Murmurs died down. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling in her gut. This wasn't just a fluke. This wasn't just a power surge. And that man in the shadows, he knew it too. Max's growl deepened. His body trembled with restrained energy. Emily clenched her fists. She didn't know what game was being played here, but she wasn't going to be a pawn. She needed to figure out the truth, and fast, before it was too late. The tension in the courtroom had reached an unbearable peak. Emily's breathing was shallow. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt as she fought the overwhelming urge to flee. Max, her loyal golden retriever, stood rigid beside her, his muscles locked in a stance of unwavering protection. The man, the juror who had been watching her, remained at the back of the courtroom, partially hidden in the shadows. But Emily could still see him, and more terrifyingly, she could feel him. It wasn't just his presence that sent icy tendrils of fear down her spine. It was something else, something primal, something wrong. The way he stood there, as if he belonged in the darkness. As if the dim emergency lighting wasn't just an inconvenience, but an advantage. Emily's mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? And why had Max reacted to him that way? The judge's gavel slammed down once more, a sharp sound that cut through the murmur of confusion still hanging in the air. "We are resuming the trial," he said firmly. "Let's continue with the questioning." The prosecution called its next witness, a police officer who had been involved in her father's arrest. But Emily couldn't focus on the testimony. Her heart pounded too hard. her instincts screaming that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Then the man moved. Emily saw it out of the corner of her eye. A subtle shift, the slightest motion toward the side door of the courtroom. He wasn't leaving through the main exit like a normal juror. He was slipping away unnoticed. No. Emily had a choice. She could stay in her seat, ignore the gnawing fear twisting her stomach, and pretend everything was fine. Or she could follow him. Her decision was made in an instant. Before she even realized what she was doing, she was on her feet. She didn't care about the trial. She didn't care that she was in a room full of people who would judge her for leaving. She cared about the truth, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Max followed without hesitation. Emily moved quickly, weaving through the rows of seats, her pulse hammering in her ears. The door at the side of the courtroom was still slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Her hands trembled as she pushed through. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, lined with closed office doors. Empty, but not silent. A soft, deliberate sound echoed. A slow, measured set of footsteps. He was here. Emily pressed herself against the wall, forcing herself to take a deep breath. She had to be smart. She couldn't just run in blindly. She crouched next to Max, whispering, "Find him." Max's ears perked up. His body tensed. Then he moved. Emily followed as silently as she could. The footsteps had stopped. A door, slightly ajar, stood at the end of the hall. The faintest sliver of light seeped from inside. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She reached the door, pushed it open, and froze. The man stood there waiting for her, not surprised, not startled. Waiting. Max let out a deep, guttural growl. Emily swallowed. "Who are you?" Her voice barely came out. The man tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a smile. "You already know." "No," she whispered, but deep down she did. It wasn't just his face that was familiar. It was his presence. Her childhood nightmares, the ones she had convinced herself weren't real. The shadow in the corner of her room when she was too young to understand fear. The whisper in her ear when no one else was there. "You've always known," he said softly. Emily's legs trembled. "You're lying." The man took a slow step forward. "Am I?" Max barked, loud, sharp, desperate. The sound shattered the moment, snapping Emily back into reality. She wasn't a child anymore, and she wasn't helpless. She reached into her pocket, gripping the small whistle she always carried. A signal only Max was trained to respond to. She blew it short and sharp. Max lunged. The man's smirk vanished as the golden retriever sprang forward, his teeth bared. He tried to move, but Max was faster. He latched onto the man's arm, a deep, furious snarl ripping from his throat. The man stumbled, knocking over a chair, his composure breaking. Emily didn't wait. She turned and ran, her pulse a deafening roar in her ears. She needed help. She needed. "Stop her." His voice wasn't just loud. It was wrong. It echoed unnaturally, stretching through the empty hallway like something alive. The lights flickered. The air turned ice cold. Emily ran faster. She burst back into the courtroom, her breath ragged, her eyes wild. The judge looked up, startled. The lawyers, the jurors, everyone turned toward her. She pointed toward the hallway, gasping, He's. The words died in her throat. The man was already back in his seat, perfectly composed, not a hair out of place, as if nothing had happened, as if he had never left. Max was at her side, panting hard, his fur bristling, but the growl was gone. The fight had left him, replaced by something else. Defeat. Emily shook her head. No, this wasn't possible. The judge frowned. "Miss, are you all right?" She couldn't answer. She could only stare at the man, sitting so calmly among the jurors, as if he hadn't just. His lips moved. No sound. No words. Just a single whisper. "You lost." Emily's blood ran cold. Max pressed against her leg, his body warm but tense. His tail tucked between his legs. He knew it too. The trial resumed as if nothing had happened. as if the nightmare hadn't just begun. Emily sat in the courtroom, numb. The trial continued around her, voices droning, evidence being presented. But none of it mattered. Not anymore, because she had seen the truth. And the truth had looked right back at her. Max lay at her feet, his body tense, ears flicking at the slightest sound. He wasn't growling anymore, but he wasn't calm either. He knew. He understood in a way only animals could. The man, whatever he was, had slipped right back into the role of an ordinary juror, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just stood in that hallway, smiling as he shattered her reality. Emily's hands clenched into fists. She had always trusted logic, facts, but what she had witnessed couldn't be explained. Or worse, maybe it wasn't meant to be. The thought made her stomach churn. Because if he could do this, if he could manipulate reality itself, then what else was possible? She glanced at the judge, the attorneys, the spectators. No one else had noticed anything strange. No one else had seen, or had they? Her gaze drifted across the room, scanning the faces, looking for anything, anyone, who might show a flicker of recognition. Then her heart stopped. One of the jurors, a woman in her 50s, was staring at her. Not with concern, not with confusion, with understanding. And then, slowly, so subtly that no one else would see, she smiled. Emily's breath caught. The realization hit her like ice water down her spine. It wasn't just him. There were others. How many? How long had they been here? Her pulse thundered in her ears. The trial would end. She would go home. Life would move on. But she wasn't safe. Not anymore. She reached down, gripping Max's fur, grounding herself. She would find out the truth, even if it destroyed her. And just like that, Emily's world would never be the same. But now, the real question is, what would you have done in her place? If your loyal dog tried to warn you, if the truth was right in front of you, but no one else could see it, would you keep searching? Or would you pretend it never happened? Could you live with the unknown lurking just out of sight? Tell us in the comments below. What do you think the strange man truly was? Was he something supernatural? A master manipulator? Or is there a truth even more terrifying lurking beneath the surface? Maybe the scariest part of all is that we'll never know for sure. But here's one thing we do know: this is just the beginning. If you love unraveling mysteries like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss another story, because the next one might be even more chilling. And if this story gave you chills, let us know by leaving a like. It helps bring these eerie tales to more people who love a good mystery. What would you have done if you were in Emily's place? Would you have ignored the warning signs, or followed them straight into the unknown? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's see what everyone thinks. Until next time, stay aware, because sometimes the scariest things aren't what we see, it's what we almost see.